Okay, I can start. This is a mandatory reporting of child abuse considerations for teachers during a shelter in place. My name is Thao. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. I'm currently the lead clinician at James Baldwin Academy for Seneca Family of Agencies. I've been with Seneca for about 6 years, and I specialize in working with children and their families with depression, anxiety, PTSD, and other trauma-related stressors. James, you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. My name is James Kirkham. I'm also a licensed marriage and family therapist. I've been in the field for over 20 years. I also work at James Baldwin Academy, which, as Tao was indicating, is a non-public school in San Leandro, California, right next to Oakland. Glad to see
Just to
everyone
get
today.
an, oh, sorry, James.
No, go ahead.
Okay, just to get an idea of who is here in the room, is there anyone here that are actually teachers or students becoming teachers? Had this training before? Give me a thumbs up so that we have an idea of people in the room.
I am a teacher.
And I'm a teacher, and I'm also security at the high school.
I'm a teacher at West Covina.
Hi, I'm a teacher at Walnut High School.
Can you give us an idea if you're currently teaching through video platforms or if you're just have a website maybe that the students are accessing, or perhaps your district is not holding instruction?
Oh, I'm teaching online, distance learning through Google Classroom.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing as well. Google Classroom through Google Meet and the video.
I do Google, and I also do Zoom meetings with my students.
Okay, great.
I'm Mike Moore. I'm a teacher at Walnut High School. Also, I teach architecture engineering, and so I'm doing that online.
And if people are comfortable, if you wouldn't mind turning on your cameras, it just makes it a lot more warm and pleasant for everybody. If you're not comfortable, I totally understand. That's fine. Maybe it's one of those hair days, but it does make it for so we can engage with everybody. Alicia is fixing her hair as we speak.
Yeah, I got workout hair. Sorry.
Sorry. Go ahead, Tao.
So if you want to start the slideshow, James. So this is going to be the schedule for this hour. We're going to do like, I think 10 minutes of introduction. We just did that. And then 20 minutes of what CPS mandating reporting, and then 20 minutes of discussion time, and then the last 10 minutes before like the checkout. Can we get a show of hands who actually have done a CPS report? So quite a few people. Okay, so most of the information for this training is from the California Department of Education Child Abuse Identification and Reporting Guide. So that's the website if you want to get more information on it. So the next slide is who are mandated reporters. So it includes anyone who works at a school. They are mandated reporter. And some of the criteria for mandated reporting are persons who are mandated reporters are required by law to report known or required by known or suspected cases of child abuse or neglect. You do not need to be physically present or witness the abuse to identify suspected cases of abuse or even have proof. The law requires that a person have reasonable suspicion that a child has been the subject of child abuse or neglect.
So I'm going to close this for a second because I've got this weird thing.
There.
Maybe it's just so sorry, folks. And please, if people have questions, go ahead and let us know. If you have a more general question about uh, child child protective services or making reports during sheltering in place, please put those in the chat, and Tal and I will get to those towards the end. But if you have a specific question about a slide that we're covering, please just go ahead and ask it. Like if something that we are discussing is a surprise to you or you have a question about.
Okay. So it's okay to consult with your supervisor and colleagues. However, the report needs to be carried out by you, the school employee, with reasonable suspicion. So the next slide is how to make the report.
Yeah, we just wanted to make sure also it's no one can absolve you of having to make the report, so or stop you from making the report. So if you believe that you have a suspicion of child abuse, if your supervisor says, "Hey, we don't need to make that report. It doesn't sound that serious to me," and you think that you do, then you should go ahead and do that.
It's required by law. If you do not make the report, it's considered a misdemeanor crime and is punishable up to 6 months in jail or $1,000 fine. The report must be made by phone as soon as possible, and then a written report within 36 hours. Okay, how to make a report. To make it a report, just contact your local social services, such as here in California, we work in Alameda County, so we reach out to Alameda County Social Services or your local law enforcement or county child welfare agency. So there's many places that you can reach out to get those reports done.
Is anybody not in California? I know this training is offered pretty widely. Is there anybody that's in a different state? What about different counties? We're in Alameda County, and that's the focus of the training. But anybody in another county?
I already did.
We're LA County.
Los Angeles. Okay. Let us know if anything is different. Like some counties, you have to report directly to law enforcement. Some counties, it's directly to Child Protective Services. In Alameda County, primarily it is Child Protective Services, but there are other ways of discharging your duty.
What is child abuse and neglect? It is a non-accidental physical injury to a child caused by a parent or caregiver or other person responsible for a child. There are major types of abuse. There's physical abuse, neglect, sexual and emotional abuse. Other states may identify abandonment, parental substance use, and human trafficking or exploitation as abuse or neglect. These are other definitions that can result as child abuse. So maltreatment of a child by a person for the child's welfare under circumstances implicating harm to a child's health or welfare, the willful intent to harm or endanger a child's health, and or different ways of providing inhumane corporal punishment or injury resulting in trauma.
Yeah, that's important. Go ahead, Tom.
Oh, sorry. Child abuse and neglect can have lifelong impact on their well-being. While the physical wounds may heal, there are many lifelong term consequences of experiencing the trauma of abuse and neglect. A child's ability to cope and thrive after trauma is called resilience, which helps many of these children thrive through and overcome their past experiences.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that calling Child Protective Services is about the caregiver creating harm to the child. So if it is not the caregiver, you may also call Child Protective Services, but that may be an issue for law enforcement. We're primarily talking about the person that is directly responsible for the care of the child. So if someone else is harming the child, it may be because the parent or the guardian or caregiver isn't watching their child carefully or isn't intervening to protect them. So that might be a Child Protective Services report, but it also may involve law enforcement because Child Protective Services is really about the caregiver.
Yeah, and it's important to recognize the signs of abuse and neglect. If you suspect a child is being harmed, reporting your suspicions may protect him or her and help the family receive assistance. Reporting your concern is not making an accusation, rather is a request for an investigation and an assessment to determine if help is needed. Warning signs of physical abuse. This can be an unexplained injury such as burn, bites, bruises, broken bone, or black eyes. Has fading bruises or other noticeable marks after an absence from school. Shows sudden changes in behavior or school performance. Is always watchful as though preparing for something bad to happen. Shrinks at the approach of an adult. Come to school or other activities early, stay late, and does not want to go home, or a child reports the injury to an adult. Warning signs for neglect is they're consistently dirty and have severe body odor or lack sufficient clothing for the weather, lacks medical attention or medical care, is frequently absent from school, and they state that there's no one at home to provide care.
So one of the things to keep in mind about warning signs of neglect is not confusing neglect and poverty. So many of us work in areas where there is a lot of poverty, and the child might not be wearing clothes that fit well. They might be wearing long sleeves and pants when it's hot. Their clothes may be dirty. They may not get enough food, and that may be due to issues around poverty and not neglect. The parents may be doing the best they can under the circumstances, and they may not have any other options. So it's still our obligation, our ethical responsibility to connect them with services and try to get them help. But that's not a call to Child Protective Services if the issues have to do with poverty rather than neglect, and that can oftentimes be hard to discern. So obviously, if you're on the fence, you're not sure, there's some ambiguity about the cause of the issues, then you do want to make a report. But if you discover that the issue is the parents are doing absolutely the best they can, but you still see these signs, then we need to connect them to services. And this is also a place where biases can come into play, biases of the system, our own biases of the people that we interact with that have power over the clients. And so this is just something to really keep in mind.
Warning signs for sexual abuse. So you can notice like they have difficulty walking or sitting. They demonstrate bizarre, sophisticated, or unusual sexual knowledge or behavior. Suddenly refuses to go to school or purposely avoid a specific person. Reports nightmares or bedwetting, becomes pregnant or contracts a sexually transmitted disease, particularly if under the age of 14. They run away, or they report sexual abuse by a person or another adult. These are some contact information for a child abuse hotline, and below that is one of the places where you would go to make a mandated report. If you just Google wherever your location is for social services, either law enforcement or welfare agencies, you can find a CPS report that you can fill out, and there's also a phone number where you can make your phone call.
So this is where we wanted to spend a little bit more time because, I mean, first of all, does anybody have any questions about your responsibility as a mandated reporter or how to file a report or when a report is necessary?
That we put our questions in the chat or ask them out loud?
No, right now you can just go ahead and ask the question if you have one.
My question, sorry.
Okay, I'm just finished. I guess,
I
so
think
my
there,
question comes around. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, go ahead, Patty. Go ahead, speak up.
Okay. So the question I have is regarding a student who has a counselor who was, you know, displaced from her house, but over and over again, I see she complains of not having food, of her parents keeping her home. The parents do drive a car. The mother is working, and the student never has the right clothes, is always hungry, and you know, when the mother comes in, she presents herself as if it's all about the child's problem, and yet she'll be wearing dark glasses, or we've heard her in the parking lot yelling or swearing at the child, and yet to our face, she's like, "Oh, thank you very much. Everything's fine." And it just feels to me like there's something underlying this family's issues.
Mhm.
So I don't know how I haven't seen anything physically done. I just see the child emotionally struggling.
Well, emotional abuse is one of the categories. It's extremely hard to ascertain emotional abuse, and it can be ambiguous where the line is. And this is another good example of where you know, cultural considerations come into play, and you know, different biases towards different parenting styles. But you know, I would say that one of the things that we covered in this training is that you're not an investigator. So it's not your responsibility to interview people, track people down, you know, talk to aunts, uncles, cousins to try to figure out what's happening. You have a reasonable suspicion of child abuse, and so I would make a report. One of the things that you don't know is that there may be other people that have made reports in the past or even currently, and so your report may be the thing that puts them at the top of the list, and CPS may say, well, wow, this is the third or fourth person that's called about this family, so we're going to go and investigate. There's, you know, the only time you would be penalized is if you made a false report. So you knew that there was no child abuse, but you made a report anyway, or you could get penalized for not making a report. And so in this case, you're seeing emotional abuse. You're seeing the family yell at the child. The child has certain telltale signs of abuse, and you're not an investigator, so you have what's in front of you.
I would also add that sometimes making a report is really difficult because you don't want to break the relationship or lose their relationship you have with the student. So maybe having a conversation with the parent, letting them know that social services or the welfare agency is there to support them, to provide resources, to get them additional help. Kind of framing it that way to help them understand, like, you are this mandated reporter and you're just doing this so that they can receive additional support, and that the CPS is the one that do the investigation and the assessment to figure out if additional support or help is needed in the home.
Yeah, and you don't do an investigation. There is a fine line because you are allowed to and encouraged to collect more information, and so where the line is between just getting some clarification, getting a little bit more information, where that line is versus doing an investigation is hard to ascertain. But you aren't responsible to like go and figure out what's going on. You're seeing signs, and so I would follow through.
Here's my question. If you go and explain that to the parent and they can say that you're accusing them, how does that affect you as a mandated reporter? So let's say you tell the parent, I'm a mandated reporter. These are some resources that I think you could use. And they're like, what are you accusing me of? Like, should you have maybe a counselor or principal approach the parent versus you, the teacher? Or
well,
just in this basic situation that Patty has presented.
You are allowed to make an anonymous report.
Okay.
So if you feel like that's in the best interest of your relationship with the family and the child, you're not under any obligation to tell the family, and Child Protective Services will not tell them who made the report. Oftentimes, I'll just tell you, the families figure it out. The kid comes home from school and says, "Oh, you know, I told Miss Patty that you were being mean to me and you were hurting me." And then they get a call from CPS, or CPS shows up on their door. I I mean, the family's going to say, oh, so obviously Miss Patty called the police or called CPS on this. We have a policy at the agency I work at that we actually tell the family unless we feel it's going to put the child at further risk, because we find that because they usually figure out who it is, and because it being more open and honest allows us to work around the issues and address the issues. But we are a mental health agency, and so you should follow the directions of your colleagues, of your principal, the other administrators that you're under. But so if you feel like it's going to be beneficial to the child and will maybe even increase rapport with the family, like, you know what, I can always trust that this teacher is honest with me and direct with me, then I would encourage you, under the guidance of your principal, to tell them. But if you feel like it's going to harm your relationship or you're not prepared to do that, then you're not under an obligation.
Yeah. I think Patty also asked if parents refuse to respond to your requests, and finally when they connect, they act like there's no problem at home. It's only the child who is presenting a problem. If you have reasonable suspicion, you can do your report, and then the CPS social worker will be the one that investigate. So it's not in your place to figure out if the parent was lying or not, but have the social worker be the one that do that. So that way you can still keep the relationship with the parent and just be kind of like you're supporting them, listening to them, and working with the student.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, it's just such a fine line because, as a school, we have talked about the student, and it's the question of, but I hear what you're saying. I don't need to be the investigator. I don't need, it took so long just to get her a response for the shelter in place, for the parent to finally, after 5 weeks, to say, oh, how do I get a Chromebook, where she had ignored every single call, but then, she was all of a sudden ready to move forward, and, was right there to help her, and no response, not, once she got her Chromebook again, there's no communication. It's just cut off again.
Yeah, there's there's the reason that it's a law, the reason that the mandated law was passed was because it's hard. This is hard to do.
Yeah.
And so if you had a choice, most of us, unless we were 100% sure, would choose not to do it, because it's you're making an accusation against somebody. It can really hurt your rapport. You might be worried about what's going to happen to the child and what's going to happen to the family.
Exactly.
So you don't. There's a law because it takes the choice out of the matter. So just like your administrator can't tell you that you can't file a CPS report or you shouldn't, the onus is on you. You are a mandated reporter, and the reason that's put in place is because it is difficult and it is awkward. And so they're just trying to take the emotional piece out of it. Because there's been many times when I have really, really not wanted to file a CPS report for many reasons. I mean, it just feels yucky,
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, and then I've told that to families, like, I wish I had a choice, but I am legally obligated to do this.
Right, because you see the relationships, how they change with the families, with the school, once they know. And a lot of parents will say, I'm telling you this, and you're not gonna call the CPS. I was like, I'm not even thinking that. I was just inquiring. I mean, it really was the farthest thing from my mind, but not from their minds. And so they're really nervous about telling me things. And I prefer that they're open and honest with me, and then I can help solve these small things that we're talking about, which might just be about food and shelter, not related to abuse. But
right.
That's why I wanted to come. But I'm sorry, I won't take any more of everyone's time. It's just is that fine line.
I just have a quick question. One of my kids last year wrote in his journal, this is why I called CPS, he wrote that his dad used to beat him.
Mm-hmm.
So our counselor was saying, well, I did it anyway just to be safe, but he's saying if it's not current, you don't have to, but that's not correct, right? Because you don't really know, right? Nope. He could just write that and it's still going on for all I know.
If they're 17 or younger and they report abuse at any age, you are required, as part of your mandated responsibilities, to report the abuse. If they're
Okay.
over 18, then you do not have to report historical abuse, but I would recommend that you do in case that individual still has access to children and is continuing the abuse. But
Thank you.
yeah, it doesn't matter how old it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
Are there other questions?
I think there's another one that says, what happens when a student does not get in touch with teachers and teachers cannot reach out to parents or they do not answer the phone? Is that systematic neglect?
Is that during our current shelter in place time, or is that during when things were before shelter in place?
I think this is
Shelter in
for
place.
Sorry?
during shelter in place.
Yeah, during shelter in place.
During shelter in place. Just remember that shelter in place has created conditions for a rise in violence that children will find difficult to escape. There's anxiety about health, education, and finances, and they're pretty high. Children aren't seeing teachers or counselors and other adults who would normally raise concerns about their well-being. And there are some households that have dysfunction, such as domestic violence, parental substance use, or a mental disorder. The risk of child abuse goes up. As long as we adhere to shelter in place, many parents who are struggling with these issues will no longer have the ability to resources or support their children to keep them fed or entertained or educated. So someone just mentioned that they were not responding to any phone calls, but when they needed a Chromebook, they responded. So it's like having some empathy for what parents are going through with their kids, with the stress, not being able to work. Maybe they're not able to work. They're not able to access certain things.
Yeah, I mean, technically, a parent is required to facilitate their child receiving an education. So they're not allowed to keep their child home from school indefinitely without, a doctor's note, unless they're providing homeschooling, and that has its own regulations. But this is such a unique time. I think that this, like Thao was saying, this probably would require, I would talk to my team, if you have a team, about it, to try to determine, because this goes back to issues around poverty versus neglect, and also, just the stress of the current situation. So if you feel like the parent is intentionally keeping the child from their education, that does warrant a CPS report. But if you feel like this is because they don't have Wi-Fi, they don't have the technology, they're incredibly stressed, they're sick, then I would try to take a different approach, which would be maybe trying to get creative in terms of how you contact them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some ways that we can help by doing small things to ease the stress of the parent. Small act of support, like maybe offering food, toilet paper, coloring books, or just an empathetic ear, can make a difference and ease some parents' stresses during this time. I think that would be supportive if you are able to do that. Mm-hmm. Remember that social distancing doesn't have to mean like emotional distancing, so we can be supported by just listening if that's what they need.
Said like a true therapist. Yeah, I mean, and this is a little bit off topic, but that might be one approach, is reaching out to the family and being like, hey, I just want to make sure you're okay. Not like, where are you? Why aren't you providing education to your kid? But it's probably already doing that. Are there other questions?
Do you mean questions about shelter in place or separately from that?
Any child abuse related questions, or could be about shelter in place, but or not, just any child abuse question.
I'm curious about so teachers now, because of teaching, like students learning at home, have kind of visual access to stuff they never would have seen before. And so I guess I'm wondering about that, and also like potentially private communications with students where students never would have put something in writing. I am no longer a teacher. I used to be a teacher. Now I work with teachers, but I was a high school teacher, and I know that these conversations, like for kids who were older, involved some negotiation where the kid was trying to figure out sometimes what they wanted to tell you because they wanted to know what you had to say to report. And I just wonder from a teaching standpoint if that is absent. Well, like we have access to new information and a limitation on other information, and I'm wondering what guidance you have about that.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that we covered on this slide in terms of what's different now, and that's why we were asking in the beginning, like how many people are still doing video teaching, because you actually do have more access into their personal lives in many ways because you're seeing into their home. And so, but one of the challenges is that it can be harder to follow up because, you know, when you have a kid with you, you can kind of sit them down and talk to them, and they may get up and leave, they may run away from you, but they're more likely to engage. But if you're asking questions on Zoom, hey, I see in your background there that there's something going on, and they may just turn the camera or hang up on you, right? And so I think it's a very delicate balance, but it's important not to lose sight of the fact that you are still a mandated reporter, and even if this is a strange role to be in, you're still required to report what you see or what you hear. But this is a negotiation that therapists, and I know you're not therapists or teachers, but we often handle, is because when we start therapy, we tell the students that we work with, you know, if you tell, the only time I'm going to break confidentiality is if there's, you know, any evidence that you're being harmed or you're harming someone else. And they know that, but they also want to tell you things that could get their family in trouble. And so that's a really fine line to negotiate. And that's also another reason why it's a law, because it would be really easy to be like, you know what, I won't tell anybody this. Just go ahead and tell me what's happening, because you really want to know, you really want to help them, you really care. But if they do tell you, you have to go through with it. I don't know if that helped or that confused you.
I would also reiterate that, let's say if the student is coming up to you and negotiating, what if this, what if that, I would just be direct and let them know that I am a mandated reporter. Yeah. These are the things I will report, but as your teacher, as your counselor, as the school staff, I'm here to support you, and I will listen, and I'll be here for you. It may not, the outcome may not be the outcome that you want, but just know that there are people here to help you if you do decide to open up and share.
And I really emphasize the goal is always to keep you, the child, safe. And so sometimes they'll get mad and they'll be angry and, you know, say you're a snitch and all that stuff. And I say, well, my goal and my responsibility is to keep you safe. And this is what I'm going to do to keep you safe. And you may not like it. You may not talk to me again. But I find that the vast majority of the time, we are able to repair the relationship with the child and the family. And oftentimes the child is telling you they have ambiguous feelings about it. So they are saying that they don't want you to tell anybody, but they're still reaching out to you because they're hoping someone's going to do something. And so whether it's on a conscious level or an unconscious level, they're telling you because they need help and they really want somebody to do something. And so they may put up a big front, but they're like, you're the one responsible adult I have in my life. I need help. I know you're going to do something about this. And so I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to curse you up and down and call you a snitch, but I'm also relieved.
Yeah, kind of like James said, sometimes the students don't want to be considered a snitch, or they're loyal to their family, but they're also experiencing pain, suffering, a lot of hurt, and they want to get the help, but just they don't know how to reach out for help, and they hope that the adult will do it for them without them having to say anything. But as employees of school, we have to be able to have reasonable suspicion in order to even make a report.
Is it Shane?
Yeah.
And does that help?
Yeah, and again, this is, I mean, I'm asking it partly because I have been in sort of conversation with some teachers, because I am no longer in the classroom, but I just, as a person who was a teacher, I was sort of thinking about that line that you try to walk, enabling students to have privacy. I guess I was also thinking about Patty's problem with the parent and the Chromebook, and wondering, you know, like, parents have much more control over their children's access to other adults right now. So I was sort of wondering also about the larger issue of what has changed recently. I'm in conversation with teachers in different parts of the country via Twitter, and I've seen a number of things saying like, what am I supposed to do at this point? I can't actually tell what's happening. These kids are totally isolated from me.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And as Thao was saying, there's been an increase in domestic violence situations. I mean, we're all experiencing the stress and anxiety of the unknown, as well as being trapped in, you know, sometimes a small house with people, and this prospect of having lost your job, or maybe could lose your job, and so that creates a pressure cooker, and sometimes we are the only lifeline, and it's very tempting to do that negotiation and say, you know what, just tell me, I won't tell anybody, I promise, and that's I totally agree with Thao. Like, I think it's much more important to be like, if you tell me this, I have to tell somebody. I have to tell Child Protective Services, because otherwise you're going to put yourself in a very difficult bind. And the kids ultimately are probably going to tell you. It's been my experience. In many years of doing this, I've had many kids come to me and like say, promise you won't tell anybody this, and I say, nope, can't promise, and then they tell me anyway. Other questions? So that did kind of bring up this last slide that we did want to discuss about what has changed. Thao, do you want to go through this?
Okay, so here's some considerations during shelter in place. So there's a lot going on in the home, including in our own lives. We would not be able to focus on child abuse. Sometimes it's difficult to have contact with students or even the parents. Sometimes contact is over the phone and not video. May be difficult to track students' location in order to make a report, because kids could be at, like, I'm at grandma's house in a different state because they're able to take care of me, or I'm somewhere else. So sometimes the kids are not even home. They're at a family member's house. You may have significant window into their students' home lives that you didn't before. It can be hard to discern what to follow up on, what's typical. And students may be reluctant to show you something that you notice, like a bruise.